We have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our European panel. From Paris, Hannah Starman is a European affairs specialist. Joining us from Berlin, Roland Tichy is the publisher and editor-in-chief of Tichy's Einblick. Also from Berlin, Paul Hockenos is a journalist and author. And from Lancaster in the United Kingdom, Geraint Johnes is a professor of economics at Lancaster University. Welcome to all of you. Let us start with Paul Hockenos in Berlin. And voting has started in these European elections. There will be 426 million people eligible to vote in the elections. What, in your view, are the issues over which this election will be fought?
European Union elections are known for the fact that people don't tend to be voting on the topics that most deal with Europe. They tend some to be often they throw a protest vote in. They're sometimes dealing with elections into the national problems. And so I think the biggest issue that we're looking at is how many people are going to vote. Now, opinion polls show that there's an overwhelming that actually support for the European Union has never been higher. It also shows that issues like climate change in Germany and France are more important than immigration. The question is how many people are going to vote and what will they actually address these issues?
Roland Tichy, the political newspaper Politico published a story on the European elections, and it characterizes this as an election, very broadly speaking, between nationalists and populists who want to halt European integration, that's on the one side, against mainstream parties urging closer cooperation between European countries. Is that a fair description? Would you agree with that?
This is a fair description because many of the voters, especially in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, but even in Sweden, in Finlandia, they do not want even closer union. They will send a lesson to Brussels, I guess, and the polls tells us that the nations are still the basic of a democratic European Union and not the Brussels bureaucrats. But anyhow, it is just a symbol, it's just a waving, because as a matter of fact, this so-called parliament, which is not a real parliament, has no real power. The power is in the hand of the government. And so this is just, as I told at the beginning, a symbol, waving your hands for or thumbs up or thumbs against, more deepening the union or holding back some sovereignty to the nations which form the European Union.
Hannah Starman, Paul raised the point just a moment ago about how many people will vote in this election. If we look at turnout in the last election, it was 42%. There appears to be a lot of apathy among European voters for this. We just heard Roland tell us that this is not a real parliament. It doesn't have real power. Does that have something to do with it?
Well, I have to disagree with this description of the European Parliament. The European Parliament is the co-legislator, and I think it is the only directly elected European body, and as such, it has much more power than people seem to believe, it's passed very important legislation that concerns us all. So I don't agree with that, and I don't think that is the issue, because I think that the European voters aren't all that familiar with the European institutions or their prerogatives. I mean, they usually speak of Brussels decisions as something that has nothing to do with them, although it's their national governments who take those decisions. So I don't think that abstentionism has to do with that. It has to do with the fact that people don't feel directly concerned with what's happening on the European level. And as someone else mentioned earlier, it's often a vote that will either reward or most often punish the current government rather than anything else.
Roland, do you want to respond to that very quickly? Hannah makes the point that this is a parliament which does have power. It passes laws which impacts every European in this union.
It is the head of the governments, and the heads of government will meet on Tuesday because they will shrink again the power of the parliament, which is more symbolic, because they are afraid of the voters who will maybe decide, as the poll says, against more deepening the union. And this parliament doesn't work. It has not one man, one vote, but different votes for different people. It has no budget. It had not a real legislative power, and this is kind of a gypsy parliament which even cannot decide where it meets. It meets either in Brussels or in Strasbourg and travels between those cities. So if this is a real power, well, I want to see what power is.
All right, let's move to Lancaster, to Geraint Johnes, who's at Lancaster University. And Geraint, of course, the one big question mark over these elections is the participation of Britain, which is at the same time discussing its departure from the European Union. How will this election shape the debate in Britain over Brexit?
Well, a few weeks ago, it looked as though Britain wouldn't be participating in these elections at all. And it's been a bit of a surprise to many parties that they are participating in the elections. One of the major things that has happened is the emergence over the last couple of months of a new Eurosceptic party, the Brexit Party, who are standing on a platform of exiting the European Union without a deal, if that is necessary. And they are currently leading in the polls in the United Kingdom. And they are expected to attract over 30% of the vote. It'll be interesting to see how well they do perform. It certainly looks, however, as though the idea of a no-deal Brexit will not get a mandate in these elections. Around 2/3 of people will likely vote against having a no-deal Brexit. A no-deal Brexit, of course, would be extremely economically damaging to the UK. The government's own forecasts suggest that 15 years out, UK GDP would be almost 10% lower than it would otherwise be if the UK exits without a deal. The other thing that is going to be interesting is polarisation in the vote, and polarisation away from the existing large two parties of the Conservatives and Labour in the UK. On the Remain side, the Liberal Democrats look as though they will be attracting a lot of votes, and they're in a battle with the Labour Party for second place within the UK. More broadly across Europe, it does look as though Eurosceptic parties are going to gain at the expense particularly of the EPP and the Socialist and Democrat group, which together have formed a majority in all European parliaments up till now. They look as though they'll need to join together with the ALDE in order to form a majority after these elections.
Paul Hockenos, these European elections, they've been described as the most politically charged elections in 40 years. If we look at Germany, in Germany, the far-right Alternative for Germany, or the AfD as it's known, has been making gains. This is what Chancellor Angela Merkel had to say.
We are confronted with populist currents who in many areas despise our values, who want to destroy Europe and its values. And we must stand up to that decisively.
So, Paul, in a sense, is this an election, is it a fight that will decide which way Europe goes forward? I mean, how significant a turning point will this be?
I think it's a very decisive turning point for all of Europe. I disagree with your assessment, however, that the far right is on the rise in Germany. Actually, if all of Europe voted the way the polls show Germans voting right now, there wouldn't be so much of a problem. Actually, the far-right AfD is in a mess. It's splintered in itself. The opinion polls show that its top priority, migration, isn't as important to most Germans anymore. There's actually hardly any immigration coming into Germany right now. So pro-Europe parties have a practically a 90% majority amongst voters. Nevertheless, and this is also the way it is in other countries as well. In Austria, for example, I'm sure the far right is going to do very poorly. And the opinion polls also show, well, they do show in general over all of Europe the far right making gains. I should point out that there are another party is also going to make gains, and that is the Greens and other environmentally strong parties are all on the rise in opinion polls. There's a new consciousness for climate change and the threat that it poses to us and to Europe. We'll have tomorrow, for example, in Berlin and across Germany and Europe, there are going to be student strike protests in favor of serious climate action. This will bring hundreds of thousands of young people, and there'll be older people on the street as well, protesting for something that they feel very strongly about, and it's something they feel that that the EU is in a unique position to deal with, there aren't going to be hundreds of thousands of right-wingers on the street. I think we've got an open election here. I think that, that these environmental parties, and I think these protests might be able to change things. I don't see the Greens and green-minded parties or environmental parties in any sense, winning and taking over the European Parliament, but they're going to play a big role once all of the votes are counted.
Hannah Starman, if we look at some of the polling before these elections, voters in most countries list terrorism as the greatest threat to the bloc, but in the countries of southern Europe, they fear natural disasters and pollution as their biggest concerns, and then terrorism. Do you hear these issues being addressed in campaigning for the election?
I would just like to return for a second to what Paul said. I really agree with you, Paul. I think we are facing a much bigger polarization than we have so far, and there will be a recomposition of the European Parliament. I don't think that the Greens will take over, as you say, but with a slightly weakened European People's Party and S&D party, there'll be a stronger ALDE. So I think all in all, the pro-European camp will remain strong in the European Parliament. So I'm not too concerned about that, and I can only welcome the arrival of more Green MEPs as well, because it's an important issue for the planet. Now, as to your question, terrorism, I don't think is the main issue for these elections anymore. I think people are much more concerned, on the one hand, with their living conditions, with their income, with their pensions, things like that, and on the other hand, with the rise of populism, those who are concerned with that. So immigration would have been more of an issue. Although in France, immigration is not that much of an issue. In France, it's really about social justice. It's about salaries. It's about living conditions. And this is where I think that the European elections are often hijacked in order to punish national measures rather than really deal with European issues.
Roland Tichy, we've just been hearing that we have seen, yes, the rise of Eurosceptics, nationalists in Europe. We've also seen, as Paul pointed out, and as Hannah pointed out as well, the rise of parties on the left, the Greens. So there's disparate groups here vying for power in Europe. Do you agree with that?
Well, first of all, I do not see that big a drama. There's just a minority who wants to break up Europe. And the fair question is, what are we going on in Europe? Do we need a European budget? Do we need a European army? Do we need more social transfers? I do not agree that immigration is not an issue. It's a big issue because of living standards and question of schooling and so on is following the migration policy. And I agree in the point that it is punishing national governments. And so we see that those elections are more of a kind of a symbol act, and they wave their hands for or against their governments. And as a matter of fact, if you talk about Germany, the European Parliament has about more than 790 seats. The Germans hold about 90 seats. It doesn't change anything if a right-wing party gets 1 or 2 or 3 seats more or less. That doesn't change the whole picture. The picture is made in the national arena in France and in Italy. And here we will see, do people agree with the national politics or not, especially in France. As far as I can see it as a German, especially in France, it is for or against Macron's policy. So this is a very different picture. The parliament is up in the skies and the people vote on the street down on earth.
Geraint Johnes, I want to get back to the impact that these elections will have on Brexit. And there's been, of course, a lot of speculation on the future of Prime Minister Theresa May in Britain. How will the outcome of this election affect the British leadership and the Prime Ministership of Theresa May?
Probably what's going to happen there is going to happen regardless of the outcome of this election. I said a few minutes ago that the fact that we're participating in these elections has caught some parties by surprise. The Conservative Party hasn't campaigned in any way seriously during these elections and may end up in 5th or 6th place in the election. And that is discounted already. Mrs May's position is weakened by the fact that she's lost the confidence, or appears to have lost the confidence, of a large chunk of her own cabinet now, and so many people expect her to resign tomorrow, or certainly in the next few days. The problem facing the new Prime Minister, whoever that might be, is that the parliamentary arithmetic won't change as a result of changing the Prime Minister. So we're still going to be left in a situation where there isn't a majority for the Brexit deal that has already been negotiated in the House of Commons. There isn't a majority in the House of Commons for no deal. And there's not a majority either for having a second referendum as a means of revoking Article 50 and remaining within the European Union. So all the routes seem to be closed, regardless of who the Prime Minister is. It's really quite a mess in the UK at the moment.
Right, Paul Hockenos, if we look at the global picture, we've seen many countries around the world which are now more inward-looking, more nationalist in the way they treat themselves. And I'm wondering to what extent foreign policy will play a role in this election. This is what the president of France's National Rally described. This is how she described, Marine Le Pen described Europe's place in the world. Let's watch.
Mais depuis,
in the space of a few months, a whole range of political forces have risen up in spectacular fashion. This is true in Europe. It's true in the whole world. The world is changing direction. We have reached the end of unbridled globalization. It's over.
Is she right? Is Marine Le Pen right there? Could this election mark another turning point where we see countries or blocks of countries looking inward, looking after their own interests rather than having any kind of global vision?
I don't think that's going to happen as a result of this election. I think that it's a fact that Europe has always punched below its weight in foreign affairs, and the present forces that are tearing it apart and the disagreements within it and within Europe aren't going to help that situation at all. Europe has been unable to respond in a strong or in a decisive way to President Trump, for example. It has been weak in the way it's dealt with China. It should be more present and it should be more decisive in the international arena, and it's not going to be able to do that until there is a consensus within the Union itself that this is what it wants to be. So I don't think we're going to see much of a change one way or the other. I think we're going to see Europe continue looking for its way forward in the international arena. And I certainly think it's needed, and Europe's voice is necessary and could be a very positive one. It's just not heard strongly enough, and I honestly don't think that this election is really going to change that in any way.
Roland, what is your view on that? Should Europe have a more decisive voice in foreign policy? I mean, if we look at the relationship between the European Union and the United States, it's been strained. We've seen the Atlantic Alliance face these strains ever since President Trump came to power.
Well, globalization is a big word. First of all, it is the question, how do we run European Union? And most people agree that the European Union should have more power in foreign policy. And this is maybe one of the problems, that the European Union does not still act as a real European power, but as a chorus of very different voices, because if a European decides the one way, you can buy out any country with some good deal for them, and they break out. We see it in many cases that money decides how a government follows the EU or its own way. So this would be the big question we should solve in Europe, to get one voice. But as a matter of fact, European Union does too much small, little, ugly things into the interior perspective. And I think that somebody in Malta or in Hungary can decide in a different way how he brushes his teeth than in Great Britain or France. So the weakness of the European Union is that it is weak in the big questions and that it is strong in the small questions.
Hannah Starman, one of President Trump's key strategists, in fact, Steve Bannon, he was a member of President Trump's administration right at the beginning. He's been traveling across Europe, meeting with far-right candidates. In fact, he's been trying to recruit parties to his far-right group, which is known as the Movement. It's based in Brussels. And he's even been acting as a consultant to some parties. Do any of his ideas have traction in Europe?
It's very interesting, and it's actually related to the question that you asked Paul about Marine Le Pen. It's funny that someone who considers herself a patriot would be advised by an American and work for the Russian president. And I think that's the case with most populists. And I mean, we've recently seen the scandal in Austria. I mean, they're running for Russian interests and not for national interests. And they are advised by foreign advisors. So I think that if anything, should compromise their standing as the voice of the people. And I think that the Austrian scandal also showed very clearly that populists are unfit to govern. I mean, they cannot remain in the government and avoid those kind of dealings. Now, as to what Roland said about buying out any country with a small deal or with money, I'm not sure that I agree with that. And I think that the Brexit negotiations are an extremely good case in point, where it was clearly shown that despite diverging interests of European Union countries, the 27 stuck together and were able to negotiate a deal that in the end is rather favorable to the Union. So what is the traction of Steve Bannon in Europe? I think, you know, he has some traction he obviously has traction with the leaders who he's advising. But beyond that, I don't know that people are very much impressed with his presence. I mean, especially not the voters of those very leaders. I think this is discrediting them in a way.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But before we go, this week we launched our own podcast. You can listen to it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering stories from around the world, similar to those you see on this program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just out for a run, give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search online for CGTN and The Heat podcast. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.